We spend a lot of time, mapping out humanity's future. We talk about AI, space
You're
colonization.
navigating climate change.
Right, all of it.
Hmm.
But sometimes the only way to truly appreciate where we are is to look back. And when you do, the sheer scale of human history, the numbers are they're absolutely staggering.
They really are.
Today, we've got roughly 8 billion people drawing breath. But if you count every single human being who has ever lived, our sources say that number is well over 100 billion.
And that ratio, I think, is the most powerful piece of context for this whole deep dive. Think about it this way.
Okay.
For every 100 people alive today, 1,250 people have come before us. This isn't just a fun fact.
Oh.
This is the immense 300,000-year-old foundation our world is built on. Every law, every piece of art, every bit of technology, it all rests on the legacy of those 100 billion people.
So that's our mission today. We're going to trace the story of these ancestors, who our sources call the guests of history.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to go beyond, just the names in a textbook. We need to understand their collective struggle, their cumulative successes, because their existence is just so essential to our reality right now. You are not a random point in history. You are the inheritor of an infinite chain.
And to understand that inheritance, we have to look at the timeline, because the distribution of those 100 billion, it's dramatically, almost incomprehensibly uneven.
We're talking about the rough 300,000-year history of Homo sapiens, right? Originating in Africa.
An expansive time, that is. Yeah, it's almost impossible to visualize.
It is.
And here is the core imbalance that defines the whole human story. The first 250,000 years.
Which is over 99% of human history.
Exactly. Over 99% of our time here. That accounted for only about 50 billion people. Half of the total human population lived in the deepest past, when population growth was, well, it was virtually non-existent.
And that glacial pace, that tells a story of extreme difficulty. Why was it so slow for so long? What was life like for those early hunter-gatherer societies?
The sources paint a brutal picture. Survival was the only metric that mattered, day to day. Communities were incredibly small, they were vulnerable.
Right.
Not only were they fighting off predators, battling starvation, but disease was just devastating. The sources explicitly point out that most children did not survive to see their 5th birthday.
Wow.
So the sheer energy required just to keep the species going meant that population numbers barely crept up for millennia.
That high child mortality rate it's a stark reminder. It means the survival of any one person long enough to reproduce was this incredible biological and social victory.
It was a miracle.
And if survival is that tenuous, then the capacity for, cumulative learning or specialization must have been so limited.
It absolutely was. That constraint on time and resources explains why progress was so slow. It took 250,000 years to reach a population benchmark that we can now hit in a matter of decades.
Their focus was just immediate survival.
Immediate regional survival, not long-term structural improvement.
But then, around 10,000 BCE, something fundamental changes. We hit the first real gear shift, the one that allowed humanity to sort of stabilize.
That was the Neolithic Revolution, sparked by the realization that we could manipulate nature.
Sowing seeds.
Learning to sow seeds and reap harvests in places like Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China.
And this was such a radical break from the past. When you secure a reliable food source, you stop moving.
Right.
This wasn't just a dietary change. This was the foundation for the first true population explosion.
The ability to store surplus food meant the end of nomadic life, and that led directly to permanent villages. This stability provided the one crucial resource they never had before.
Time.
Time to develop non-survival skills.
Right.
And that leads to the birth of the first great civilizations. Sumer, Akkad, Egypt. That stability, that was the game changer.
And the numbers show it. After 10,000 years of the agricultural revolution, the world population hits about 300 million by 1 CE. What's compelling is that during this era, we start to move beyond anonymous struggle and find specific figures, people whose gifts have lasted until today.
Exactly. The collective knowledge of that era was distilled by these incredible innovators. We see Hammurabi giving us the first comprehensive written law code.
Giving structure to these now complex societies.
In Egypt, you have Imhotep, the master architect who built the first pyramid, showing that large-scale construction was even possible.
And then further east, Panini, whose work codified Sanskrit grammar. That shaped not just the language, but the very structure of intellectual thought in that part of the world.
And of course, you can't forget the foundational contributions from the Greeks. People like Archimedes, whose work in math and physics still underpins engineering today. They synthesized the knowledge of the era into enduring, portable gifts.
Rules.
They handed us the tools we needed for the next 1,000 years, a period often mislabeled the Dark Ages.
And we really need to reframe that label. From roughly 500 CE to 1500 CE, maybe parts of Europe faced decline, but globally, knowledge, art, philosophy, they were all flourishing. And critically, knowledge was being preserved.
Oh, absolutely. The mechanism of preservation during that time is extraordinary. While Rome was declining, knowledge centers in the Islamic world were preserving and actively expanding on Greek and Roman texts.
Like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad.
Exactly. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, where Al-Khwarizmi wrote the foundational books on algebra. The very word algebra comes from his work.
And then in Cordoba, in Andalusia, you had El-Zarawi essentially laying the groundwork for modern surgery.
Advancing medicine in huge ways. Meanwhile, in China, during the Song dynasty, Bi Sheng invents movable type printing.
A technology that would later revolutionize the West. This was not a dark age. It was an age of accelerated knowledge transfer between global hubs.
But this era of intellectual progress was sharply, catastrophically interrupted by population collapse. The greatest shadow over that time was the Black Death.
Between 1347 and 1353, the numbers are just. They're horrifyingly difficult to grasp.
PFR.
Our sources estimate 75 to 200 million people died in Europe alone.
Which at the time was nearly 1/3 of the entire world population.
Can you even imagine that? The trauma, the sudden emptying of cities and villages?
The demographic loss was just incomprehensible, but this is where that peculiar historical irony comes in. The sources suggest that this disaster, it forced a massive structural shift.
So is the idea that tragedy is like a necessary prerequisite for progress?
Yeah.
Did this sheer loss of life create a vacuum that forced innovation?
It seems to have been an accelerant. The feudal system was all based on abundant, cheap labor.
Right.
When that labor vanishes, the value of the individual worker skyrockets. Suddenly, there's this immense pressure to find technological solutions, and workers have the power to demand more freedom, better wages. This destabilization, it laid the economic groundwork for the Renaissance.
Which brings us to the second, and truly exponential, gear shift, the Industrial and Scientific Revolution, kicking off in the 1760s.
Famously with James Watt's improved steam engine in England.
Right.
And that machine didn't just automate tasks, it unlocked vast energy resources, fossil fuels that had always constrained human output. The moment we tapped into that, we broke the limits on production and, crucially, on transport.
And you see that acceleration immediately in the population data. By 1800, the world hits 1 billion people, finally.
Finally.
But just 1 century later, by 1900, it jumps 60% to 1.6 billion. That's swift, but it raises a question. How quickly did that translate into the infrastructure, sanitation, clean water, mass food transport that you need to support that jump?
That's the core linkage. The new wealth and organizational capacity of industrialization allowed for systemic public health improvements that previous generations could only dream of, but the largest acceleration that was still to come.
In the 20th century, this is where the human population truly explodes.
Yeah.
6 billion people were born in the 20th century alone.
It's a shocking fact.
The number of people who lived in just the last 100 years nearly equals the total of all of preceding history combined.
And that staggering boom is a direct function of science finally defeating the core mortality issues that plagued the 100 billion who came before us. We minimized the struggle they faced every single day.
We finally defeated the two great killers: infection and starvation.
Exactly. Look at the timeline of these life-saving technologies. In the 1920s, Alexander Fleming discovers penicillin. The age of antibiotics begins.
Curtailing death from common infections.
Then in the 1950s, Jonas Salk develops the polio vaccine, conquering one of the most crippling diseases. And in the 60s, Norman Borlaug, with the Green Revolution, develops high-yield wheat.
Conquering widespread famine.
Yes. These innovations just crushed infant mortality rates and extended the average lifespan by decades. They removed the limiting factors that had governed us for 300,000 years.
And just like the earlier eras, the 20th century left us its own roster of giants who shaped the modern world.
We talk about Marie Curie changing physics forever, Alan Turing providing the foundations for the modern computer,
Rosalind Franklin,
whose work unlocked the structure of DNA. And, of course, Martin Luther King Jr., who redefined civil rights and social justice globally. They built the technological and ethical world we inhabit right now.
Which brings us back to Isaac Newton's famous observation: if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants.
It's not just modesty. That is the core mechanism of human success. The power of cumulative knowledge.
No one in that entire 100 billion ever truly started from scratch.
Never. Every new insight is a block placed atop a million preceding blocks. If you trace the scientific thread through our sources, you see this chain so clearly.
Take math and physics.
Ah,
Pythagoras gives us the initial framework for geometry.
right. Then Euclid comes along and systemizes it all in his texts.
Centuries later, Descartes combines geometry with algebra.
And then Newton takes that and applies it to the entire universe with his laws of motion and gravity.
And then 2 centuries after that, Einstein comes along and redefines it all in the context of space-time.
And this building process is just as crucial in the development of thought and ethics. Confucius provides a foundation for societal morality. Socrates teaches us to question everything.
Aristotle codifies logic.
And that foundational thought flows into figures like Avicenna ibn Sina, who compiled vast medical knowledge, which later informs Spinoza's definitions of freedom and ultimately shapes Kant's Enlightenment philosophy.
That structure of thought is literally what shapes your moral framework today. But we can't just focus on the famous names. The critical detail, so often overlooked, is the importance of the unsung ancestors.
This is so vital. We focus on the figures who crystallized the knowledge, but the immense majority of that 100 billion, they were the ones doing the essential groundwork. We have to remember the nameless individuals.
The Mesopotamian farmer who persisted through crop failures until they perfected seed selection.
Yes. Or the Roman engineer who figured out the fluid dynamics needed to build the first reliable aqueduct. The Chinese printer who worked out the subtle mechanics of movable type.
There also are giants. They are part of that 100 billion. The ones who achieved the small essential innovations that became systemic knowledge without ever getting a monument.
They reduced the collective struggle tile by tile over millennia, which leads us to the analytical takeaway for you, the listener.
Right.
You carry the genetic material, the language structure, and the societal ideas of 100 billion lives. That's the existential reality of this whole deep dive.
Your cognitive abilities, your language, the stability of your society. They are the direct, measurable result of 100 billion cumulative struggles. For you to be here today, every single one of your predecessors had to answer yes to some incredibly critical life-or-death questions.
They had to overcome disease, survive the climate, evade predators, secure a mate, and protect their children long enough for those children to continue the cycle. Every generation, every single individual ancestor won their specific struggles against overwhelming odds.
They all had to win for you to simply exist and be listening to this. And that heritage comes with a profound responsibility. The source material asks us to consider, what will you leave behind?
Right.
Because 100 or 200 years from now, people will be tracing their ancestry, and they won't just look for famous names. They will analyze the structure you lived within. They will ask, what did those people do to advance or preserve the chain? What foundational knowledge did they leave for us?
That is the ultimate test. The 100 billion guests came, they lived, they went, but they aren't lost. Their efforts built the world, their breath. It created the atmosphere we now breathe. Their steps paved the path we walk on.
Their cumulative words created the language and concepts we speak.
You're not a speck in history. You're the continuous, evolving edge of a line that stretches back 300,000 years.
You are here because of a struggle fought by generations who overcame impossible odds just so you could exist and potentially see further.
Now it is your turn to become a giant for the next generation. Whether it's the technology you refine, the lessons you teach, the family you raise, or the ethical values you defend, all of it will become the foundation upon which your descendants stand. The story of the 100 billion is not over, because the moment you understand their legacy, your responsibility and your story is just beginning.